Hello and welcome to the first episode of Dissecting Horror. I'm your host Ben, and today we're going to be covering the first half of Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror film, The Shining. The Shining was released in 1980 from the great Stanley Kubrick based on a Stephen King novel of the same name released a few years prior. Yeah, you already know it's going to be a good movie. Although I do have a few small confessions to make before starting this video. I don't really find what most people consider to be the classics scary. Except for this one. This is the only movie from the 70s or 80s to actually creep me out, which is why I decided to cover it first. And it's such a big movie that I have so much to say about that we have to cut this into a two-part video, which we'll talk more about at the end of the video. Although I am a little bit scared to cover a movie like this. The Shining is quite possibly the most overanalyzed film of all time, having every single little detail being broken down to its core. There's even a whole documentary about people's interpretations of The Shining called Room 237. Some of my favorite theories are about how this movie is secretly about the Holocaust, Native American genocide, and a hidden confession as to how Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing. In this video, I'll be loosely covering some of those theories, but for the most part, we'll stick with a surface level analysis. In this video, I'll be referring to a deep dive article written by the film critic Rob Ager of Collative Learning, who I reached out to see if I could use his stuff for the video. He said yes, although he did want me to say that even though I'll be pulling from his articles, that doesn't necessarily mean that he condones my specific interpretation of The Shining. Either way, thanks for letting me use your article. Speaking of the movie, I've done enough talking. Let's get into the events of the movie. The movie begins with a lot of wide sweeping shots of a single yellow car driving up a mountain as we get the iconic opening theme composed by Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind. These shots were filmed in Glacier National Park, Montana, but this shot of the infamous Overlook Hotel was filmed in Mount Hood, Oregon. The Shining actually used a lot of very modern camera techniques that were sort of unheard of for its time. These shots were filmed with a helicopter, and it was one of the first movies to use the new Steadicam technology, which was operated by the guy who invented it. After that, we cut forward a little bit to The Interview. This movie is split up into parts like the original Stephen King novel, which I haven't seen many movies do before. We meet our protagonist, Jack Torrance, played by the one and only Jack Nicholson, in what very well might be one of his most iconic roles. He heads to the hotel manager, Stuart Ullman's office, and we get the first of many subjects of countless conspiracy theories. That being that the layout of the hotel just doesn't make any sense. There's plenty of other examples of this in the movie, but the easiest one to explain comes right here. Since we follow Jack into the office, we see that there's a hallway that should run right behind Mr. Ullman's office, but when we get to his room, it's apparently in front of the outside world. This gets even weirder when you learn that all of the interiors that you see in the Overlook Hotel, while being inspired by the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, are all sets that were built specifically for this movie. The working theory is that this exists to emphasize the something is off feeling about the Overlook Hotel. We then get to go meet some of Jack's family members, his wife Wendy Torrance, played by Shelley Duvall, and his son Danny Torrance, played by a young Danny Lloyd. Danny asks Wendy if she really wants to spend the whole winter in the hotel, and that Danny is worried about making new friends there. Poor guy. She brings up his friend Tony. Oh, that's sweet. You planning on bringing a friend to the hotel?
I don't want to call them Mrs. Torrance.
Oh. At this point in the movie, Tony is set up to be nothing more than Danny's little imaginary friend. In the book, Tony is actually revealed to be Danny from the future, speaking to 1980 Danny, although nothing like this is actually confirmed in the film. Back in the interview room, this weirdo Bill Watson is there now, who doesn't play a big role in the movie, but he's the on-season caretaker of the Overlook Hotel and Stuart Ullman's right-hand man. Ullman tells Jack what to expect with the job, saying that it's not a physically demanding job, but the isolation can be pretty bad. Jack doesn't really care, and even shrugs it off as a good thing.
Well, that just happens to be exactly what I'm looking for.
Ullman then goes on to talk about the, quote,
tragedy we had up here during the winter of 1970.
Ullman explains that the previous manager hired a man named Charles Grady to do the same winter caretaking job. He took his two daughters with him, and at some point...
He ran amok and, he killed his family with an axe.
Ullman blames it on cabin fever, but the people on the internet surely don't. Jack seems surprisingly okay with this, shrugging it off as a crazy story. Back to Danny, he's brushing his teeth in the bathroom and asks his imaginary friend Tony if his daddy got the job. Tony said that he already did and that he would call up Wendy in a few minutes. More evidence to suggest that this is actually Danny from the future. Danny looks at himself in the mirror and tries to ask Tony why he doesn't want to go to the hotel. Tony's being a little stubborn brat and doesn't show him, but eventually caves. Oh, come on, Danny, why wouldn't you want to go spend time in a place with so much Kool-Aid? And look, this is the friends you were concerned about making. Closing day! Jack is bringing his family up to the hotel, which is the perfect time to explain to your 5-year-old son about what the Donner Party was.
You mean they ate each other up?
They arrive at the Overlook just as everyone else is leaving, and Mr. Ullman comes out and finds Jack in the waiting room and comes to get him. Of course, as soon as I'm done reading my Playgirl magazine. Danny's off playing darts with himself in the game room. He goes to pick up his darts and sees the same two little girls from his little vision earlier. Now's your chance, Danny. Go make some new friends. Oh, wait, they're walking away. Don't worry, Danny. I'm sure they want to play with you forever and ever. Ullman takes Wendy and Jack on a tour through the hotel, and we get these amazing, long, unbroken shots of the hotel interiors. Once again, I'm going to praise the set builders for these sets.
I built this little set in my bedroom and it took me like 2 weeks.
Basically, building an entire hotel for a single movie is a feat that I can't imagine doing. They get taught how to use the snowcat just in case they get snowed in over the winter. Meanwhile, Wendy and Danny are off talking to the hotel's main chef, Dick Halloran, played by Scatman Crothers. Halloran tours them around the kitchen, showing them all the different meats they have in the walk-in freezer. He calls Danny Doc, something his parents tend to call him, and Wendy asks him about it, bringing up the fact that he shouldn't logically know that they call him Doc since they just met.
How do you know we call him Doc?
Halloran tries to laugh it off and says that he just looks like a doc. They go into the storage room and Halloran psychically offers Danny some ice cream.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?
Wendy goes with Jack and Ullman to tour the basement, so Danny and Halloran sit down with a bowl of ice cream. Halloran explains to Danny how his grandma and him were able to hold entire conversations without ever opening their mouths. He called it shining. Danny just won't open up with his experience about the shining because Tony, the little boy who lives in Danny's mouth, says he isn't supposed to. Halloran explains that people that have the shining ability can see things that have either happened before or are going to happen that normal people can't. He tells Danny that a lot of things have happened in the Overlook, and they weren't all good. Danny then strangely asks about room 237. Halloran basically tells Danny there ain't anything in room 237, but to stay the flip away from it. Fun fact, in the book it was room 217, but it was changed because the Timberline Lodge actually had a room 217 and not a room 237. And they didn't want to scare away customers. Interestingly enough, room 217 is apparently the most requested room at the Timberline Lodge, so I guess it all worked out. We cut to a whole month later. Danny is riding around his big wheel in an unbroken Steadicam shot with really cool audio. Wendy brings Jack a fashionably late breakfast, and Jack reminds us that he does need to do some writing. After all, it's a Stephen King story, so the main character has to be a writer. He's got plenty of ideas, just no good ones.
Which is the same reason why I never upload.
Wendy and Danny go for a nice walk in the Overlook's massive hedge maze, while Jack looks at a model of the same hedge maze instead of writing anything. The music builds as we follow Wendy and Danny through the hedge maze, never being able to see what's in front of them. And then we abruptly cut to a Tuesday card! This is one of the only things I would consider a jump scare in the movie, so now I can add to my achievements list that I've been jump scared by the word Tuesday. We don't know how long it's been since the last scene before the date card, but it's clear everyone's getting pretty lonely. So lonely, in fact, that little Danny is considering going into room 237. As he's turning the doorknob, he gets another shine of those spooky twins, which is enough to drive him away and never look back. At least until he's around the corner. Jack, meanwhile, looks like he's finally got some writing motivation. Look at you go, Jack. One thing about this scene that I've only seen one person talk about in this movie is the importance of the book besides the typewriter on his desk. This book is very clearly supposed to be a scrapbook of the Overlook's history. You get a semi-decent look at it here. There's a whole chapter in the novel about Jack finding the scrapbook down in the basement. It was gonna be a scene in the movie apparently, but it got cut. Wendy comes in and asks Jack if he wants some sandwiches, but Jack's a little angry and doesn't really want anyone interrupting him. So he not so politely tells Wendy to get out of his office. One other noticeable thing in this scene is that the chair in the background here, it's here in this shot. We cut to Wendy, and now it's gone, and I cut back to Wendy, and there it is. It's realistically a simple continuity error, but a lot of people on the internet have refused to let this go and consider it a hidden clue or something. After all, there are some shots in this movie that took an insane number of takes. The highest amount I've heard is 127 takes for a shot we'll get to later. So a continuity mistake in a Kubrick film is never seen as just a continuity error. What is presumably the next day, we see Wendy and Danny running around the snowy outsides of the Overlook. This might seem a little weird coming from me, but I find Danny wearing his big bulky snowsuit to be hilariously adorable. He reminds me of the kid from A Christmas Story. Jack, however, looks like he's gonna look crazy. A few days later, now Saturday, Wendy realizes that the hotel's phone line is down, leaving their only way to communicate with the outside world is with the dinky radio in Mr. Ullman's office. Wendy just radioed them to confirm the phone lines are down. Meanwhile, Danny rides his big wheel down the isolated hallways of the Overlook, all alone. Poor kid. If only he found those girls from earlier again. Speak of the devil.
Come and play with us.
Look, Danny, they even want to play with you. Actually, Danny, I don't think the YouTube people would like you playing uncensored bloody dead kids. Maybe some other time. No, that's good, they're gone. Danny goes into his room to grab his toy fire truck when Jack calls him over and has him sit down with him. Jack asks some basic questions, and Danny goes full interrogator mode, asking stuff like as if he would ever harm him or Wendy. Jack obviously says no, since he's a good person, right? A bit later, Danny is playing around with his toy cars and trucks on the hotel's famous carpet design, when a ball rolls out of absolutely nowhere. So Danny stands up, and we get another illogical factor of the hotel. The carpet design does a full 180 in the next shot, where Danny is now facing away from the straight brown line. Danny walks down the hall and sees that the only door open is, of course, room 237. Wendy is down in the boiler room? Electrical room? Furnace room? Somewhere. She's in the basement, when she hears a scream from somewhere up on the main floor. It turns out it's not murder, and it's just Jack having a nightmare upstairs. The scene works well for a smaller form of jump scare, since we already have the tension from the previous scene of Danny in room 237. While it is a false payoff, meaning it wounds up paying Jack having a nightmare instead of something in room 237, we as the audience feel almost bad for Danny and want to see him survive more than the other two in the family. At least I did. So in the next scene, when we're left on basically a cliffhanger as to what's going to happen to Danny, and in the next scene, we hear this unexplainable noise coming from above, we start to worry for Danny. Wendy rushes around the corner and into the main area of the hotel. Maybe she wasn't in the basement, and wakes Jack up.
I dreamed that I killed you and Danny.
Oh, that's awful. Wendy sits on the floor and comforts Jack for a bit, until Danny rushes in, proving he made it out of room 237 seemingly fine. Except for that bruise on his neck. Wendy runs over and asks Danny what happened, but he doesn't say a word. She looks over at Jack, whose face screams a mix of, "What's going on?" and, "Uh-oh, I got caught." Wendy accuses Jack of doing this, and she runs off with Danny. Jack walks towards the bar in the gold room, basically a party hall for the hotel. Jack walks in and sits at the bar and has perhaps the most epic staring contest with the viewer ever. Hey, he found my joke funny. Wait, what the hell? This is Lloyd the bartender, played by Joe Turkel. He's a ghost, hallucination, imaginary friend? Nobody knows. He starts talking to Lloyd and ends up getting a free drink out of it after asking to sell his soul for a glass of beer.
Goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
Jack rants about Wendy and Danny to Lloyd, more so Wendy. He explains to Lloyd and the audience about how he ended up dislocating Danny's shoulder one time 3 years ago. A movie invention. In the book, he actually broke Danny's arm. Right as that finishes, Wendy runs into the gold room screaming about how
There's a crazy woman in one of the rooms.
We then abruptly cut to a weather broadcast from Miami, Florida, which for some reason is covering the weather all the way over in Colorado. We reunite with the one and only Dick Halloran, sitting in a room with way too much nudity for YouTube and way too many lamps. Seriously, why on earth do you have 4 lamps? Unless you're Joyce Byers or something, nobody needs that many lamps. Halloran out of nowhere ends up having a sudden shining FaceTime call with Danny and notices that the little brat stumbled into room 237 despite what he said. This shot of Halloran looking at the ceiling terrified was another scene that was shot an insane amount of times. Accompanied by another ear-piercing score, the shot is mainly scary in the way that we slowly zoom into Halloran's face, and how much time we're given to imagine what could be up on the ceiling. Danny spazzing with the foaming mouth is also a pretty creepy image on its own. Jack winds up visiting room 237 to try and find the crazy lady in the bathtub Wendy was talking about. He walks into the bathroom that has greener walls than a Marvel movie production, in hopes of finding this crazy lady, but the only thing that Jack sees is a hot lady. Well, at least Jack thinks so. The people at YouTube probably won't, so pretend these clothes are better animated. Jack looks at her the same way I look at my pizza I'm reheating in the microwave at 2 a.m. Jack and the mystery girl end up having a little makeout session before Jack looks at himself to make sure he doesn't have any spinach in his teeth. But instead of looking at spinach, she ends up looking at a lot of decayed skin on the woman's back. Jack decides that she's no longer his type and tries to leave, with the whole dead person stuff. The real crazy lady he finally found starts to find Jack's backing away to be really funny. Okay, it's not that funny. Yeah, I would leave too.
And that's where I'm gonna have to cut for part 1. I know it sucks being a 2-parter, but this was just such a massive video. It was about a 12-page script by the time I finished writing it that I had to split it into 2 parts. Don't worry, part 2 has already been written, it has already been recorded, it is just in the process of being edited. You can expect it to come out within the next week or 2. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss part 2 and so that I can pass NASA in subscribers. As for now, I've been your host Ben, this has been about half of a film analysis, and I'll see you in the next video.